I'm Gigi, known as Gianna in the SCA, and I am one of your instructors today. Jessica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Zahra. People call me Jess a lot, so you probably hear that too. And I am also a co-instructor slash facilitator.
We want to thank you for coming today. We're going to ask that if you hear anything during this lecture or the panel that makes you feel uncomfortable, that you sit with that and think about why you're feeling discomfort. Many of you are here because you realize that we have to talk about race despite discomfort. Race is everywhere, and racial tension and animosity and pain is almost in everything we see and touch. Ignoring it does not make it go away. So that's why we're going to talk about it today. My truth is that I live in a society where the color of my skin says a lot about the prognosis for my success in life, whether it's education, seeing a doctor, driving, going to a grocery store, going to a mall, traveling on an airplane, joining a hobby. It touches everything. And that reality is a reality. So ignoring my race isn't going to change that. The problem that we have with racial inequity and injustice in our society and in the SCA is not going to be able to be wished away. We have to tackle the problem with action, and we will not know what needs to be done if we are not willing to talk about it. So I want to thank you for being here today to listen to us talk about it and perhaps ask some questions. Jess, do you have any intro words?
Not really. What I want to do is encourage people to really not get too hung up on the language until we explain and we discuss terms. I know that some of these terms are unfamiliar. Some of them may kind of get this instinctive defensiveness, or you may already have made assumptions about some of them, and we will talk about them. And if we do not, please ask for further clarification before you jump to expressing that defensiveness.
Okay. So the first slide. The purpose of this lecture is to provide you with examples, tools, and resources to understand how to be anti-racist. This lecture will also prioritize the safety, dignity, and humanity of the people of color and the people that belong to marginalized groups in this room. James Baldwin had the right of it when he said this quote. He said, "Until we understand our history, we cannot be released by it. Knowledge, I believe, is power." So this lecture is about sharing powerful knowledge to help everyone in this room and everyone who watches this video later, because the history of racism affects us all, and we all need to understand it in order to dismantle it and be released by it.
Very briefly, I want to also expound. So the term anti-racism is new, and we'll talk about more detail about what that means, but people are already very familiar with the term racism. And I think it's always good to make sure that our mental model of the word racism is away from this static interpretation of intent or state of being. Racism doesn't always go hand in hand with white hoods or other extreme or violent examples. This isn't the only way we conceive of this word. Racism is potentially a part or inaction that you can be participating in intentionally or unintentionally. And so as we continue to break this down, we can talk more about what this word actually means to better understand what the term anti-racism means. So.
Agreed. So the term anti-racist means or refers to people who are actively fighting against racism, all types: interpersonal, institutional, structural, systemic. We've learned all these terms. If you are acting in an anti-racist manner, it means you are working against racism. And I guess action is the crux of the matter. It's not just your own beliefs. It's not just your own intention. It is your behavior. No one is born racist or anti-racist, right? Those two paths result, and the labels that go with those paths result from the choices that we make. So being anti-racist would mean you are making a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. That requires self-awareness, self-reflection, sometimes checking in with your friends, people who know better than you, asking questions, learning more. It's not linear. It can be, you know, can be kind of cyclical, right? So the bottom line is, though, that being anti-racist and behaving in an anti-racist manner means believing that racism is everyone's problem, that we all have a role to play in it, and that you are going to do something about it. It's not about who you are, it's about what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And like Jessica said, in the absence of making anti-racist choices, taking anti-racist action, you would actually be likely upholding unconsciously aspects of white supremacy, and the resulting unequal institutions in society and our hobbies, etc.
I want to go through the next slide and then I will jump in again.
Okay. So a lot of people, you know, would say, well, I'm not racist, so I don't I don't need to go to this class because I'm not racist. So can I just not be not racist instead of anti-racist? And the reality of it is that scientists, social scientists, help us understand, you know, race and behavior. There is no such thing as not racist. It was a difficult thing for me to accept personally. But after having to suffer micro abuses from people in the SCA who say they are not racist, it helps me understand the truth of it. No one is just not racist, not even people of color. We're all part of a society where messages of white supremacy are given to us from birth, from different sources. They come from family, friends, news, music, movies, television, work, and school. So it's inescapable. So you were either behaving in a racist manner or anti-racist manner. You were either upholding white supremacy and helping dismantle it with your actions. And it's a choice we all get to make, and we get to make a new choice every time a new situation presents itself. Jessica?
Okay, so this is a very kind of contentious part of understanding for a lot of people. So I do want to sit with this and unpack it a little bit more. There's very, very few people who contentedly, unabashedly identify as racist, right? It's just not a thing. People don't want to claim that label. People don't want to acknowledge that label. People don't want to hear that term. Again, they have in their heads this kind of violent, extreme, egregious example, when in reality, most racism is systematic. So the methods that it is upheld are by participating within that system, which is something you can do passively. So to really understand how we're using this term and how we're using the term anti-racism, what we need to do is we need to acknowledge inaction is an action, right? When you choose to do nothing, the default prevails. And if the default is problematic, then you have chosen to do nothing in the face of a problematic system, which means you are contributing to it. You might not mean to, but that is unfortunately the reality. So when we talk about this, when we talk about these very loaded terms, it's not about who we are. It's not about who we imagine ourselves to be. It's about what we do and establishing knowledge and cultural understanding so that we can push back against these structures, which means we need to divorce that critique of our actions. We need to divorce that innate kind of resistant defensiveness. We need to move past but I'm not racist, and understand that unless we are actively taking actions to dismantle the system, we are participating in it. And I also think that one thing we'll talk about more over the course of this panel, and one thing our panelists will talk about, is the concept that we may not always realize that our actions are pushing back against the system because they're not what we envision to be that sort of work. But many people are already participating in the SCA in very actively anti-racist ways. So that's that.
So at the end of this slideshow, there's going to be a couple of slides on the resources. The steps that we're going to talk about at a very high level are broken down in several different books, articles, YouTube videos, and I'll have all this for you a little bit later. So being anti-racist first steps. When we choose to behave in an anti-racist manner, we are choosing to become actively conscious about race and racism and to take actions to end racial inequities in our daily lives. So that includes our hobbies. I found it interesting that in the Racial Healing Handbook by Dr. Annalise Singh, she reminds us of the importance of being purposeful, that you need the intentional mindset of, I am willing to do something about this because it's everyone's problem. And I honestly think that is the first step, to decide that you want to be part of a solution instead of doing nothing and inadvertently be remaining part of the problem. So being anti-racist would be different for white people than it is for people of color. For white people, a lot of times there's a disconnect from racial identity for white people. So one of the steps would involve developing an understanding of racial identity, yours and others. And then also accepting and acknowledging privilege, working to change any kind of internalized implicit biases that you have, challenge them, or understand what they are and then challenge them, and then be willing to interrupt racism when you see it. For people of color, it means recognizing how race and racism have been internalized. Because like I said, the messages that we all got came to the people the messages are about, as well as the people the messages are not about. So for instance, I was looking for a doctor since I moved to the Pacific Northwest. And I really didn't want to deal with medical racism. So I was looking for a Black doctor, a Black surgeon to be specific. I found the Black surgeon. I found another surgeon that was white. Both of them on Instagram, both of them talk about. Let me stop my dog. Give me 1 second. Okay, both of them have great reviews. In the back of my head, I thought to myself, but the Black doctor probably isn't as good as the white doctor. Like, why did I think that? Because I received those same, stereotypical messages. It made me doubt my first mind to choose someone that I thought I would be more comfortable with, because of that nagging concern that, oh, maybe I'm choosing a surgeon that's not up to par. That's an example. Recognizing internalized racism and challenging that within yourself, and understanding if it's been applied to another group of people of color. For instance, I identify as an African American or a Black American. Do I have messages that have been internalized about Hispanics, people from the Middle East, people from Africa, Native Americans? I need to examine that as well. And then the next step for me would be interrupting patterns of prejudice or racism against those other groups. Jessica?
Yeah, I taught a class earlier where we talked about basics, and one of the things that we really get deep into that is a very basic concept for DEI is unconscious bias. We all have it. It is inescapable. Biases help us navigate the world. They help us make judgments about others. They're not always bad, but they are frequently the result of the messages we receive through media and through the same kind of systems that we want to encourage you to deconstruct. So it is very important for everyone to deconstruct their unconscious bias. And it is very important for you to understand that your unconscious bias may or may not align with your declared beliefs or worldviews. It may or may not be for or against your in-group. Gigi talked about identifying as Black and still having that kind of internal concern. You may have had poor experiences with your in-groups, and it may lead you to some degree of bias against them. You may feel more comfortable in your own in-groups, which leads you to bias outside of them. But in any case, that awareness and that interruption is really the key to that first step, right? We can't fix what we don't know, what we're not aware of. So really navigating your own internal bias, becoming aware of it and deconstructing it is very important. You're muted.
Gigi, you're muted.
I muted myself and forgot. Thank you for putting your questions in the chat box. We're going to ask a couple of those, I think, before we switch over to the panel, just to get some of them out of the way. And I also want to make an announcement that some of these aspects, some of these concepts are going to be covered in Kiva's talk at 4:30 about being an ally. So you might want to put that on your calendars if you weren't already planning on going there. She's going to explore some of these concepts more. You will notice once you meet the panelists that they are majority white. And I chose them on purpose because white supremacy is a white construct, and it's a construct that white people benefit from. So to that end, I believe that deconstructing white supremacy can only happen by white people. So I want to thank all the people of color on this panel and working behind the scenes for doing the type of emotional labor that you're going to have to do in this class. I hope that all of you can take the information that we share and begin working to chip away at white supremacy, because it's a very harmful system to live under. It takes a toll on all of us. Audience, please keep your mics muted, just reiterating that. And that leads us to our panel introduction. So
can we pause really quick?
Yeah.
Does everyone feel at least comfortable with working definitions? Our panelists are gonna talk more. They're gonna talk about experiences. We're gonna reach deeper understanding, but I want to make sure everyone here has some degree of comfort in the ways we are using the terms racist and anti-racist. Okay. Going once, going twice. Okay, great. Thank you. I know it's a little bit different than the typical usage.
Okay, we're about halfway through the hour. So let's see. We have a couple of questions. Genevieve, can you read us the questions? And if the questions are for Jessica and I, we can answer them. If you'd rather wait and ask them of the panel, of all of us, then we can wait until the end. So let's see.
I have one for Honor, and I think this might be a good time for this question. I've presented in the SCA and World as Native American ancestry for 50 years. Genetics say I am 1%. How do I present myself when confronting racism? Am I marginalized, ally, or what?
Well, I would wonder.
Is this open for anyone to reply, or?
I would like to open it up to the panel, but I want to introduce you guys first. So let's do the introductions. And I'm going to move away from sharing the screen so they can see your faces. So Zahra and I will remain on the screen as the facilitators of this panel. We have Duchess Kiva, Duchess Dagmar, Lord Fino was not able to make it today, Countess Fortune, Sir Justin, Viscountess Lindis, Baroness Maimuna, Sir Roberto, and Viscount Seamus. So let me stop sharing. Put this on speaker view so the recording will work to that end. And I think anyone on the panel who'd like to answer the question should just go ahead.
Do y'all mind if I quickly address something with this question? So the framing of the question, it's a great question to start at. Hi, I'm Sir Roberto. One of the issues that a lot of indigenous communities have brought up, and especially in the context of forced assimilation and genocide, is the idea of a blood quantum. That, you know, one of the historical ways in which settler populations have established who is white versus who is indigenous, you know, so on and so forth, is by percentage of parentage, right? If you have, you know, 1/8 black if you're 1/8 black, then you're a black person according to some laws in Louisiana, Dred Scott case, so on and so on and so forth. With that, I want to highlight the issue that when we talk about percentages in genetic history and in heritage, indigenous communities have had a lot of issues and a lot to say about that, right? A lot of indigenous communities, I have argued, hey, it's not actually about blood percentages, whether or not you're from the res, or whether or not you were brought up in our culture, or whether or not we've welcomed you in, right? So reading, I think, doing some exploration around percentages and heritage, I think would be a good idea. If you are not indigenous, then I personally believe that you are not marginalized in the degree that indigenous people are. So keeping that in mind, I think where is positionality? Where are you relative to the marginalized population? It gets a little difficult because indigenous populations are still living, right? These are alive, living, changing, and breathing cultures that have had their own ideas change across the centuries. So keeping that in mind, I think, is particularly important, and being informed about heritage and the issues surrounding heritage and who indigenous people want to claim as their own versus who indigenous people do not want to claim on their own. I think that would be particularly helpful.
I also am going to very quickly say something that it's maybe a little bit general, and not incredibly direct to this question, but keeping in mind that race exists as a social construct. And so a lot of the things that people face as a result of racism are in and of themselves due to much more than you can simply categorize, right? This isn't based on scientific principles that we can be objective about. How you look, whether or not you pass for the dominant group or not, how you sound, there are many things that kind of go into whether or not you face marginalization in the world, right? There are several people with the same genetic background as myself, as far as they are also multiracial. They have kind of the same percentage of the dominant culture here in the US, which would be white, and they can pass much more easily than I can. They don't face the same issues that I do. And so you take that into account with addition of your lived experiences, your background, your family, your language, your history, all of it. And all of it kind of comes together, I think, to give us each a very personal answer of where we fall and where we're comfortable and how we identify.
Could I address it real quick as one of the other indigenous in the room? So you gotta also remember genetics and DNA, totally different things in the way they're measured and looked at. And there's also a lot of non-indigenous DNA in the whole studies because we've kept it. But you also have to remember how you were raised, where you were raised. Also, things like the Dawes rolls and blood quantum really are kind of horrible things, and we inflict them on ourselves too. So even people who grew up on the reservation versus people who didn't, it's all there. So there's no one-all answer to that. You just have to decide for yourself how you want to fight your fight. So just kind of throwing that out there.
Thank you.
Could I just ask? I wouldn't mind just saying very quickly, and I will be covering more of this piece, which is an awkward piece for many of us at 4:30 for my talk. But when we think about concepts around, and now I don't know how the person who framed the question identifies, but when it comes to sort of whiteness or white passing, that's not a dichotomy. And I used to think of it very much as a dichotomy. You were either white or you were white passing. And now I recognize it much more as a spectrum. Like, we are complicated people with complicated histories and family, and it can be difficult to figure out where you fit, what to focus on, what responsibilities does this give you. And I don't know your specifics, but some of this is hard, and we're sort of dealing with it
in real time as concepts around allyship develop, and the tools are being developed. So yeah, I guess I would say that is a lot of these things are spectrums. They're not black and white as things go on.
Thank you. Nina, do you have any other questions that you want to run by the panel before we begin with the questions I have for the panel?
No questions per se. There was a question about giving some tools and ways to address microaggressions. And I know that there are some other classes that will be addressing those specifically. But one of the notes that I did want to bring in that someone said, note that Indigenous communities are not monolithic and have different answers. And that is the same of this entire room and entire panel. You'll find that we often say in these spaces, there is not a very clear, like Duchess Kiva said, black and white answer. Other than that, please, questions for panels.
Okay, so our first question is going to be, what does being anti-racist mean to you? And we had a couple of people already slated to answer. So Roberto, would you like to start us off? What does being anti-racist mean to you?
Hey, yeah, I would definitely like to start off. So being anti-racist is a lot. I'm very much an academic person, so it's very an academic process to me because there are so many bodies of knowledge that we can draw on. The answers are actually pretty there, which is great. It's the trick is being able to find them. For me, being an anti-racist is making deliberate changes to how I think about a problem, how I think about a situation. I used to be a professor, so an example of this would be, for example, creating my syllabus to be particularly informed of non-white authors, right? So I would teach a class on sociology, and all of like the majority of my authors would be specifically non-white, right? So that's one small, teeny tiny but impactful effort. Another one is legitimately being able to internalize some of these ideas of, hey, maybe the way that I was brought up contains some genuinely harmful ideas. I'm Puerto Rican, like born and raised from Puerto Rico, and I moved to the contiguous United States for grad school. And in Puerto Rico, we had a lot of ideas that turns out were kind of racist against Puerto Ricans. And being able to acknowledge that and sit with it and kind of go through the emotional process of it is particularly important. But I think the biggest one for me is like what Zahra and Gigi have already said, like the idea of action, right? Being able to go out and do something. And it doesn't need to be revolutionary, like fundamentally changing society. But for example, going like helping people who are seeking immigration asylum, right? Or being able to tackle the idea of food deserts in your community, right? Where I live, there's a massive food desert near my neighborhood. So what do we do? We help farmers markets, right? We participate in those farmers markets with what we can, like selling eggs, for example. Creating small moments of community that address the fundamental harms of racism in the various ways it shows up. Because racism is not just, right, one thing, one result. Racism finds itself in food, in housing, in education, in beauty, in aesthetics, in class, so on and so forth, right? And being able to do something about those things, even in a small personal way, that to me is what an anti-racist means.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I also want to ask Sir Justin if he has any thoughts on this question. What does being anti-racist mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm Sir Justin. I'm from Ontario. Anti-racism, I'm going to dig a little bit into something that Kendi uses as an example in his book. Racism is largely about power. It's about power and policy and institutional systems that perpetuate inequality amongst racial groups. Racist is defined a little bit differently in that it is individual actions or attitudes, behaviors that people engage in. And for me, when I look at being anti-racist, I look not just at myself and the behaviors that I attempt to utilize in engaging with people, but also attempting to and actively seeking to oppose those choices we make as a culture, uh, you know, in everyday life with regards to policies that perpetuate ideas of racial inequality, but also directly addressing the issue of the SCA. I seek to seek actively to dismantle those systems that exist, which perpetuate ideas of inequality as well. The idea that, one of the things that Zahra did that I think was incredibly powerful when she was in the office of uh, DEI for the corporation, and while you were on the board, Gianna, was the change to our corporate documents that specifically, went about doing things like deconstructing the idea of what period of history we were embracing, what we valued as an organization, and very specifically looking at things like advancing the bullying policy, advancing the idea of of the ethical goals of the organization, in the I don't know what to call it, the preamble, or the fundamental opening of the organization, and seeking to address those things in every action we take. In my other panel, I brought up the idea of trying to meet people where they are. So we have someone in my local group that is very interested in Machika culture. And one of the things that we've been very actively doing is speaking with her about how she wants to present herself, how she wants to receive awards, how she wants to interact with the SCA in the way that the rest of us, who are white and European already do, right? So we've been very specifically going and finding those things that we think that she would very much appreciate, and speaking with her. Does she want to receive, awards in a form that are appropriate to her persona as she wants it to be realized? Which is to say, an example is we recently gave her a chocolate cup, which was a close replica of something that was done historically for people in the Machika culture. And, trying to meet people where they are, and provide value to those things for people who come from different cultures, different races. And, uh, so that for me is what it is. It's a dedication to be opposed to those policies in the sense of power, and individually to attempt to behave in a manner that is anti-racist. It's always a journey. There are always things that one finds about oneself as one goes along, where we have blind spots, so to speak, where we have hold attitudes that are inherently at odds with our personal, goals, and recognizing those, learning about them, and then acting to correct them, take responsibility for them when we're wrong.
Thank you. Duchess Dagmar, what does being anti-racist mean to you?
Hi, Duchess Dagmar Antir. I'm also a Laurel from the West Kingdom and a Viscountess of the West. And I've been in the SCA for a really long time, and I have grown in my own beliefs and values along with my participation in the SCA, like many of us here. And I just want to quickly say up front that being anti-racist in the SCA is it's a work in progress. So if you feel that you or people around you are not progressing at a rate that you wish they would, that I think that's pretty universal, and that that any progress is still great. So I just want to really sound encouraging there. But I also want to say that I'm a teacher. So anti-racism in education is really, really important. I'd love if people can just do a thumbs up on their screen. I'd love to know how many people here are teachers in real life. I suspect there's quite a few, any kind of educator. Because you'll know that, yep, librarian counts, absolutely. So I think that this matters a lot to me, because we talk a lot in education about reducing harm to students from the practices that we were taught. And hang on just 1 second, please. I have teenagers talking about Dungeons and Dragons in the background, and they were under strict instructions to be silent during this time. So boundaries are always important. So anyway, in education, we talk a lot about reducing harm to students. And if from the well-intentioned practices that we were taught as teachers, and we were taught in educational institutions to that were the best options for students, and that we knew what was best for students. So there is a lot of conversation around this in educational communities, and there's a woman named Dina Simmons who I read some of her things. I like her. She is a Black educator herself and advocate, and she talks about the need for a vigilant self-examination to be anti-racist, and to acknowledge how institutions and organizations promote whiteness at the expense of those who are not white, to study and teach representational history, to talk about race with students and don't shy away from it. Even if it is uncomfortable, students have a huge capacity for talking about these issues. Young people do. And then when you see something, do something, obviously, but also to shape the future. And I really like this framing because I think in the SCA, we are an educational organization. That is our first and foremost mission. And I would say if you're feeling discomfort or you're feeling lost in the weeds about what you can actually do to be anti-racist, as an educator, I would say I look to educational settings and look to educational teaching because on the subject, because I find it accessible, and because if it's focus on engaging people, other people, and teaching them about being anti-racist. That is for me being anti-racist. I can't just sit and be anti-racist at things. I have to, I need to promote it and encourage it in others. So, but also I'm a special education teacher. And so being anti-racist for me is about intersectionality and understanding how marginalized people are often multiply marginalized, you know? And so there's a thing called DisCrit, which is critical race theory and disability, critical disability studies, sort of combined in philosophically. And for me, being anti-racist means understanding that how these other identities and experiences intersect with people's experience with race. So again, there's lots of materials out there you can read on your own, but I think I think what's most important is to really consider how we're teachers first in the SCA. That is our primary goal in the SCA. It's right in Kapora. So and to think about that, think about how you as an individual can use that to, to harness that in your own attempts to be anti-racist. Good.
Thank you, Dagmar. And last we have Seamus, Viscount Seamus.
Hi there. So I think we need to do three things when we're being an anti-racist. So what it means to me is we need to educate, we need to stand up, and we need to challenge. So for educate, I grew up in a really small Oregon coast town. There was one person of color in my school. I was completely clueless about anything till I joined the SCA, got out, started, meeting more people. And so we need to educate ourselves, especially people who come from similar backgrounds who just don't even have a clue. We need to educate each other. So we need to educate our friends. We need to educate those people that we see within our game. We need to educate our people in our society. And then we need to stand up. We need to use our office, our titles, our peerages, our crowns, our cornets, our peers should be leading, and our offices should also be putting forth the ideals that our society is trying to uphold. I was a social media officer when we started as a kingdom and ultimately as a society, deciding that what you put on your personal page can affect whether you can play in our game. And as that social media officer, I had to, turn over information to society and to the kingdom to fight these people who are putting things on their personal page thinking that it's okay because, you know, I am not posting it on an official site, but you are an officer of the society, you are a peer of the society, you are a member of our society, and saying those things is not okay. Posting those things is not okay, and we need to stand up for that sort of thing. And then we need to challenge ourselves and constantly reevaluate our ideas and whether they're coming from a place of anti-racism or racism. That's all I got.
Okay, thank you. So we're hearing themes of education, calling in and alongside to your friends and your social group. And I think I agree with that totally. And it's one of the reasons that I asked these particular people to be on this panel, because they are all people who have been in the SCA for quite some time. They have social capital. They have chosen to use that social capital to behave in an anti-racist manner that I have observed personally firsthand. And so I'm really appreciative of that, which is why I wanted them to be able to share their experiences so others can maybe learn from them. So Jessica's going to handle the second question.
Okay. So our next question, why do you want to be an anti-racist? And we're going to start with Fortune.
If Fortune can figure out how to unmute herself, she would love that. And actually, I was thrilled because when I was listening to Viscount Seamus, I was like, oh, I want to hit some of these points. So thank you so much for being an excellent lead-in. Being an anti-racist. So I think when it really hit for me that I needed to be doing more was listening to an episode of Voices of Color with yourself, with Gigi, and Genevieve, where you were just like, yeah, our non-person of color SCA friends who think they're really good allies really, really suck at it. And they can't, because they can't see. When it's not something that affects you personally, it's very hard to see those microaggressions. It's very hard to see the structures and how they're built. And like listening to another episode recently about the College of Heralds and just how Eurocentric that process is and how it needs to be decolonized. I was like, this is never a thing that has affected me as someone with an Italian persona with a very easily conventionally documentable name. Oh, I need to do more. I need to be helping and pushing back. I have had the opportunity in the SCA to take on some of these roles. I was Queen of the East, and you get to be in an NPC role. You are no longer yourself. You're a non-player character, and everything you do is to make your kingdom, the people in your kingdom, the people in the society, make their experience better, safer, more enjoyable. And so we, Ozra and I went to Gigi's class that she held at Penzic about unconscious bias and bringing in DEI, because you need to top down show that we are doing this. My king right now of the East, Matthias, is in this panel at this event today, you know, leading the way, showing, hey, this is what we need to do, even though I am not a marginalized group, really, aside from being a woman. Like, how can I make this better for others? I then took on the role of being Kingdom Chatelaine. I am the East Kingdom Chatelaine. So again, being anti-racist is extremely important to my role there. Just gave a report in our Kingdom Curia this week of, as Duchess Dagomir said, the work is never done with DEI. It's never going to be something we accomplish. It's done. We've checked it off. No one's racist anymore. None of our structures are built to marginalize anyone. We did it, everyone. Cookies later. Like, it's always going to be ongoing work, and meeting people where they are, listening to them, because your experiences. I grew up in a small town in New England. Again, there was like Viscount Seamus, there was really one person of color in my school. And she was a transracial adoptee. So it's like like 2,000 people in my town. Like, and you don't know what you don't know because you don't have those life experiences. And it's getting out there, it's speaking to people and making space for the people who have gone through in the SCA as people of color who are having those personas, who have those experiences, listening to them, taking your own ego out of it, and hearing their experiences. Because it sucks to hear like, oh, I've probably been a shitty ally at some point. I've probably said shitty things. Okay, great. That's in the past. How do I make it better going forward? There we go.
Thank you. So we also have Maymuna.
There we go. Hi, everybody. I have some very strong ethical beliefs that I got from my family of origin. My father's people were union organizers, and I have a Catholic worker aunt. I went through being a politically active hippie and was mentored by people in the American Friends Service Committee and in the Civil Rights Movement. So I had a big theoretical belief in anti-racism, but the compelling reasons that are more in the heart than in the mind came from moving to New Orleans and from a very segregated Northern Virginia location. The culture, the things that you can gain by being in the midst of a diverse community is really rich and powerful. And I just feel like there isn't enough good in the world. There's not enough knowledge, creativity, compassion, that we can push any of it aside because of the color of the person offering it to the rest of us. So I think it is not only the right thing to fight for, it is a very rewarding thing to fight for.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Roberto, I've got you for this.
Yeah. So, like I said before, I'm Puerto Rican, so born and raised. I know my grandfather used to call me the Puerto Rican gringo because I am very, very white, but I am from the Caribbean, which Puerto Rico, for those of you who don't know, is a colony of the United States. So being anti-racist is important to me because that literally affects me as a person, right? It's amazing because I was raised bilingual, and thanks to Disney movies. But one of the things that happens in the SCA, it happened a lot in the beginning, now not so much because people know me and I've been in the same kingdom for all of my SCA career. But it's always what's your name, Roberto? And it was like, oh, that's your real name. Yeah. And then the switch happens, right? Like, oh, your English is so good. Thanks, buddy. Your Spanish is terrible. But I digress. The point of that is to say that, frankly, even people who are white passing like myself have both benefited and been harmed by racist structures, right? Racist structures in the large scale from a colonialist imperial perspective, and also the interpersonal perspective of, you don't sound Puerto Rican, you look Puerto Rican, or, oh, you're Latino. So suddenly the conversation and the tone shifts of how people refer to me and how I'm kind of looked at and perceived. I remember one time I was pulled over by a police officer, my fault. And I had a Puerto Rico driver's license, and they were like, well, do you have your green card? Like, excuse me, sir, no, Puerto Ricans are citizens of the United States, right? And that is one example, right, of a history of what I've had to deal with. I've had people deny myself my Puerto Rican heritage throughout my life because I don't look or sound like it. So all of these things are particularly important because it affects who I am as a person. But also, if I'm really going to get into the heart of it, it's kind of like what Maimuna was saying. It's the right thing to do, period, end of sentence, right? This being anti-racist is important. It's what we need to do to build a just society. So that's what we need to do. Okay, let's do it.
Okay, thank you. And then I've got Seamus for this. We've got a few more questions, and we want to make sure everyone gets a chance, so we will have to move through responses as succinctly as we can.
I'll be quick. So our society as a whole we're better with diversity, we're stronger with diversity, and we have to be anti-racist to achieve that. I did not come to terms with or come out as bi until I joined the SCA. The people within the SCA really helped me on that journey, and I want that same support and love that I felt in the SCA for people of color, with inspirational equality and being able to push for that kind of change. I feel like people within the queer community need to especially be willing to stand up and fight for people of color. And just as to be selfish, I really like my friends that are people of color and I want them to stay around. So I really want to be able to support them and make our society better.
Thank you. All right, Gigi's got the next question.
Okay, so 3, give an example of how you uncovered a personal bias and what you then did to begin challenging it. And we're going to start with Maimuna. So example of how you uncovered a personal bias and then what you did to start challenging it.
Okay, when I came here to New Orleans, I was already retired and I decided to do volunteer work. I had done a lot of women's shelters, domestic violence shelters in Virginia, and I was really burned out with that. And someone suggested that I become a CASA. Although the humor now, the irony of suggesting someone burn out become a CASA is really obvious to me at this point. But anyway, that's a court-appointed special advocate for the foster care system. So I went in with what is obviously a white savior, hippy-dippy point of view that I know what I'm doing and I can help people. And I had my own preconceptions of what was wrong with the families and what their dynamics, what their issues were as I went into it. And about 6 months in, of course, you go through training and all that. About 6 months in, I hit this wall where I realized how little I knew, and I felt like I couldn't help anybody. Who the hell am I to address issues like this? Fortunately, as the timing would have it, they sent me to a convention and for the national organization, and I went to the first classes I ever had been to on anti-racism and on systemic racism and how racism plays out in the foster care system, including with social workers, et cetera, who are themselves people of color. And so that was the beginning of a lot of reading for me. And I changed my whole view of what the role was. I did eventually get burned out, but not for that reason. So not in the SCA, but I think applicable to our discussion.
Agreed. So next we're going to have Zoe. Kiva.
I want to talk about the time I wove a swastika because I did that. So for background, in tablet weaving, and I'm a tablet weaving Laurel, in the Viking Age, swastika was a very common symbol. So I was doing a kingdom entry. I was working with the museum in Copenhagen to recreate a very specific band. It took me like 3 years, and I was fermenting lichens. And at that stage, it was very hard to get the pattern. So I was like working off of photographs from the museum. And this band in particular did have a swastika. And I can remember thinking at the time, this was kind of before that what happened in Caid with their majesties wearing from the swastika had happened. So a lot of us were weaving it and very myopically. So I was thinking, okay, I've got to, like, I really want to have this authentic. I'm going to enter it in Kingdom Arts and Sciences, and I'm in Ontario, as many kingdoms are. Their arts and science competitions are really important. So I entered this piece and I won, and that was fantastic. And then this thing in Caid exploded. And I remember talking to my friend Amina in the SCA, she's Black. And I was sort of, processing things verbally. And she said, can I tell you something? And when she was a little girl, she was traveling with her family in sort of the center of Canada, which is quite rural in this area in Saskatoon. And, it was a very small town. They were the only ones in the hotel. And when they woke up in the morning, somebody had spray painted swastikas on the windows. And so she says, when I see that symbol, it makes me feel very unsafe. And in that moment, I realized that I was prioritizing authenticity above how other players feel and above how other people feel about safety and what people might think when they see me and that entry. And it completely changed. And I realized that because I had done this entry publicly, that I really wanted to do something public to acknowledge what I had done and what I had contributed towards. I'm sure other players were also feeling unsafe seeing, trim like that. And I invited the other Laurels, I was Laurel at the time, to work with me on a public apology. And I only had one other. There was a few of us that had woven the symbol, but only one other one that wanted to work with me, named Reagan Leaf. And Reagan Leaf and I put out a statement that we had done this, that we were very sorry, that our perspective wasn't right. We were focusing on the wrong things. And then to sort of help try and fix it. One of the things you can do in tablet weaving is adjust. As a weaver, you can adjust your patterns, that we will work with anybody wanting to adjust that out of the pattern they want to make. So we will work with anybody, on our own time and do that to help. And now, of course, it's all settled that symbol is banned, but there's times in the SCA we need to think about not just what's authentic to our time period, but there is a real world context to what we do. And nothing is more important than people feeling safe.
Thank you so much. I believe that because we are getting short on time, we want to make sure everyone has a chance to at least touch on a lot of these questions. We're going to jump around, and if there's time at the end, we'll circle back. So we're going to ask the next question, which is, how have you interrupted interpersonal racism in the SCA? And I would love to hear from Lindis.
I would love to talk about this. There are so many ways to interrupt. And and I think about the ways that I personally have done it. I've been in a multitude of situations where there have been overt racist statements to more subtle microaggressions. The one that sticks out for me the most was in the evening party kind of a situation, and somebody had just very casually reached over and asked my partner to touch their hair. My partner is Black, and that is a very taboo thing to do. And I said, no, why are you even asking? And I share this because that intervention actually was upsetting to my partner. Because in my mind, I was like, ha, here I go. I'm going to do the right thing. And I came on just a little too strong in that moment in a group of trusted friends with a very heavy-handed intervention. The take-home point that I really want to get across here is really considering, whenever we're doing any kind of intervention, what is going to be the best way to bring people along with us in this work. Sometimes that way is going to be modeling, right? Just like literally behaving the ways that we want to see. Sometimes that intervention is going to be a little playful, right? A little jokey, making sure that the other folks around us have an opportunity to save face, learn from the moment, recover, and come along. And sometimes those interventions are going to be more brusque, curt, because the behavior is egregious, safety is at stake, or that person has been brought alongside many, many times, and it just hasn't worked up to that point. So when I think about all of the different ways that we can intervene, right, it's really thinking about building our own arsenal. Like, how can you intervene non-verbally with your body language, your facial expressions? How can you intervene verbally with trusted people and bring them alongside of us? And how can you intervene when the chips are down and safety is at stake? I think a lot of the times whenever we're talking about these kind of interventions, people automatically go to confrontation and conflict, and that makes us all want to back away from it. When the reality is, like, humans have conflict constantly. And so one of the things that has really helped me in this journey is to get out of binary thinking, to really embrace this idea of dialectics and a balance, that two things can be true at once. I can make a mistake and still be a good person. You can make a mistake and still be a good person. I can make a mistake and be a bad person, right? Like, all of these things can coexist. And when we can do that, that actually helps us to control that instant emotional response and think about what is going to be the thing that brings people along with us with this work. Because that is what's needed. And one of the questions in the chat was like, DIB is a dirty word in a lot of contexts. How can we account for that? Treat it like it's not a dirty word. We acknowledge that in some cases it has been used as a weapon, and in other cases it's been used as an educational tool. Both things are true. And how can we proceed with it as the thing that we do as humans, as opposed to using it like a hammer, right? How do we live this as opposed to using it as a mission?
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're gonna do fortune for this question, and then we are definitely getting down to the nitty-gritty. So it's gonna be a little lightning round for the rest of it.
Again, Zahra, you've picked perfectly, because I definitely want to build right off of what Lynn just said. So one of the situations that I've come across, so you get overt sort of things, and then you get sort of passive situations. It's way harder to see those passive situations. And they can be a little, you can sort of meet someone with grace if you can tell sort of you're misstepping the, can I touch your hair? Like, I've definitely had that interaction of like a younger SCA person who's sort of from a more rural area was like, wanted to touch a person of color's hair. And I was like, hey, maybe we talk about, we always ask before we touch other people's bodies. But then there was a situation where I was in an order meeting, and someone was like, could we stop using modern political language on the order list? And they wanted to no longer use the word inclusive. And I lost it. I was did not have the grace that I should have had for someone else at that point. But I was like, no, we've taken out, like, there's no reason not to use inclusive. There's no reason to make our space less inclusive. We have taken out, the Western European centric in the SCA, guidelines. Well, and the person's response was like, well, just because the BOD says that doesn't mean we have to actually. And I was like, no. And it's standing up, and it is meeting this head on. And, there are times where you do have to stand up and to these overt sort of things and use interrupting language, which I'm sure is something that Genevieve's going to talk about at 1:30, of like ooh, we don't say things like that here, and practicing those phrases. So you interrupt that interaction. And also, like, sometimes you just got to make somebody say the quiet part out loud. Like, what do you really mean when you say you don't want us to use inclusive? Do you want the non-cis het white people to stop talking? Because that's what it sounds like. And yes, DEIB can be a thing that people have issues with, preconceived notions, sort of like, the Affordable Care Act versus Obamacare. Like, if you use one word, but if we're making a space more welcoming, we don't need to say, hey, we're doing this thing. We just have to make these spaces more welcoming and inclusive. and make space and support the voices of people who have been marginalized.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's funny that you mentioned the hair touching thing, because when people do that to my fiance, what he does is gently cups their cheek and go, I thought we were touching each other. They stop. All right, next question.
That's hilarious, Jessica. So question number five is, tell us the story of how you took on one of the 6 responsibilities to become an anti-racist. The 6 responsibilities are written about in one of the references I'm going to show you later from an article entitled White Supremacy Culture Change Work from 2006. And they are the 6 responsibilities: read, reflect, remember, risks, rejection, and relationship building. So we're going to ask our panelists, and I gave them that ahead of time, so this is not a pop quiz. They're going to tell us a story of how they use one of these to become or behave in an anti-racist manner. And I'm going to ask Van to start us off. Sir Justin.
All right. So with regards to this issue, I grew up in a very unusual environment for an American. I grew up in a neo-Hindu commune, which was an outgrowth of the hippie movement of the 60s. And there were people of color around me, and I belonged to a very marginalized religious experience and those sorts of things. But what I realized very rapidly was the extent to which I had an expectation that people would behave like I did, right? And what I mean by that is I expected Black people to behave like white people. I expected, Latinos, Latinx, if you prefer, to behave in the same way, right? I had all these expectations of how people would behave, because in spite of the fact that there were people of different races, we expected a homogenization of culture at a certain level, right? And that the sense that this white supremacy that we exist in is the default state of our society, right? The value of people, their capacity to engage academically, their capacity to engage in everyday life is limited as much by their physical appearance as by their conduct, and the extent to which they fulfill the stereotypes or break from the stereotypes that we have for them. And so for me, it's always been a struggle, not in the sense that I overtly struggle with it, but that I'm perpetually finding myself in a state where I must remember, right, that there is not a way to be, right? There is not that white is not the default of existence, right? That other people have an experience that is shaped very much by not just their personal beliefs or their religion, things like that, but just simply by their appearance. When I was younger in the SCA many years ago, this would be about 35 years ago, there was a woman who was, I believe she was first generation Mexican immigrant, possibly second. And I didn't know her overly well, but I had some conversations with her that I'm confident in saying that. And she wanted to do a persona that was based to an extent on Aztec or Incan. I never did quite figure out what she was actually doing, but something that was not typical European. And she spent all of this time developing the persona, developing the clothes. She had a cloak made of cormorant feathers and all of these very ornate clothes that she wore. And it was always that she was an outsider to the court, right? And when she was introduced in court, she was outside it. When she was brought in to talk about things that she was wearing, it was as though she was a stranger, right? And it was very much something that I assimilated, in the sense that I was like, oh, that's the way it is. The SCA is European. The things that we do are focused on Europe, right? And it slowly dawned on me over time, as I educated myself, as I learned, as I grew into adulthood, just exactly what that had meant, right? For that person attempting to interact with the SCA, they never could be wholly part of it, right? They never were offered the opportunity, and largely it was not just because of you know, the fact that they wanted to do this Aztec persona, but the fact that everyone just assumed they would, to what some extent, because of their appearance, right? They were you know, they brown skin, dark hair. They had an accent that was you know, notably colored with Spanish, with Mexican Spanish, and so those sorts of things were realizations, and things that I always have to keep in mind. You know, that we need to make space, and we need to allow people to experience the SCA in the same way. You know, and actively pursuing the goal of remembering and fighting against that tendency to forget.